I'm Martha
disabled
Minow, and it
students.
is just
It's
a
amazing.
total delight and thrill for me to introduce our great guests and also our colleague and also a film. So I'm going to be quick because we have a lot we want to do. Constance Baker Motley, one of the most outstanding lawyers and jurists of the 20th century, is the subject of a new film that we will get a chance to see. And we have the great good fortune to hear about the film initially from Joel Motley, graduate of the school, class of 1978, someone whose own career deserves a film, but who will be here today talking about the film. And we will then also have the chance to hear from Tomiko Brown-Nagin, who is the Paul Professor of Constitutional Law and who happens to be writing a biography of Judge Constance Baker Motley. So I can't imagine better people to help orient us to someone who is truly a hero, one of the most outstanding jurists and lawyers, who worked with my former boss, Justice Thurgood Marshall, who talked in awe about Constance Baker Motley. Joel.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Martha. Well, I won't take very long to say much about the film other than a little vignette that I am able to do in a captive audience like this. I can't do it at a film festival because they don't let you talk until the end. But I think this is helpful to appreciate something you'll see later in the film. And it basically is this, that you may know that to become a federal judge in the United States, at the district court level, the only way that happens is if your senator in the state you live in sends your name to the White House. And in 1964, when my mother's litigation career was coming to an end, she joined the state Senate in New York. And then the Johnson landslide happened that fall, and Lyndon Johnson's elected overwhelmingly as president, and Bobby Kennedy is elected a senator from New York. And one of the first things Bobby Kennedy did was to send my mother's name to the White House to be a federal judge. And then Bobby Kennedy attempted to consolidate his power as the most important Democrat in New York because all the other statewide elected officials were Republicans: Nelson Rockefeller, Jack Javits, Louis Lefkowitz, all Republicans. And he figured a way to send a message that he was the #1 Democrat would be for him to designate the person, the state senator, who would be the majority leader in the state Senate, because in the landslide, Democrats got control of the state Senate for the first time in 20 years. My mother, like the other Democrats in the Senate, though, thought the fellow who had been the minority leader for 20 years, Joe Zaretsky from Upper Manhattan, should become the majority leader, the way it is in the US Congress and the Senate and any other Senate in the country. So she went along with the majority and did not vote for Bobby Kennedy's designee. And Bobby Kennedy's designee lost. And curiously, my mother's nomination to be a federal judge just stopped moving anywhere. A year went by, she became Manhattan Borough President. She ran into Bobby Kennedy one day at an event and said, "Let me give you a ride in my car." Got in the car, they chatted. She said, "Whatever happened to my nomination?" And he didn't answer. He just got out of the car and walked away, like not goodbye, like not I'll see you, like nothing, like you're dead to me. And he didn't hear or think about her for another year after that until a phone call, which you will see in the film, that he got from President Johnson. So I'm inclined to just sort of leave it there, and then we'll talk about some more stuff when it's over. Okay, good.
And what a tribute from a son to his mother. Congratulations to Joel on the film and for the storytelling. I thought that what I would do is to ask Joel a few questions and then open it up to the audience to have him talk more about the film and about his mother. So one of the things that the film does so well, both in terms of how it's shot and its symbolism, is to evoke your mother as a lawyer, her presence as a lawyer. Her largeness, her depth, her competence. I wonder if you can talk about something else that's hinted at in the film, but which isn't explored as fully, and that is what she was like as a person. We can see it in her sparkling eyes. She's very witty, deliberate. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about her as a person.
Let's see. She was very funny, as you could get a little bit of the film there.
Yes.
She was fierce, you know. She was a fighter in a very, very tough struggle, and so she had all of the kind of sense of organization and mission that you find in anybody who's doing something really heavy and scary. And she was very warm. She's a great mother. She was fun to be around, and it all kind of worked out.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Another thing I thought I would ask you about is the quote from Harvey Gantt, who said that one of the things that really struck him was her name, Constance Baker Motley. Mm-hmm. So she continued to incorporate her family name into her name after she was married and as an attorney. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what it meant to her to be a woman attorney, a married woman attorney, and one who was signifying something by going by the name Constance Baker Motley.
Yeah. Well, she came along before the women's movement, so there wasn't any sort of set of role models out there about how to navigate, you use this name, that name, do you wear pants or do you wear dresses, and all that stuff she had to kind of make up on her own. I mean, one of her law school classmates was Bella Abzug, who was a congressman in New York, who was a very different sort of woman, very kind of, in a much tougher, kind of rougher mode. But one thing that I often think about when people ask me just that question is that there was a profile of her in the New Yorker done in the late 90s, and the interviewer asked her about the first time she argued in the Supreme Court. And having done 10 cases, but the first case must have been very tense, and he said, "What did you do to get ready for that first argument?" And she said, "I went to Lord & Taylor and bought a new dress." So she, she was pretty comfortable as a woman, and I think she was particularly fortunate in that both Thurgood Marshall and my father were unusually evolved for men of their time. My father was not threatened by my mother's celebrity, and that was rare. And Thurgood was completely at home with her because she could do the work, and that's all that really mattered to him. And of course, I was perfect. So that made it easier. So if you're going to have a busy legal career, you should have one child, and it would be strategic to have them be perfect.
Ah, indeed. I wonder if there are others who have questions for Joel. Yes, Dean.
She had a career in politics after being a lawyer and before being a judge, and I wonder whether that seemed like a different kind of moment in her life, and also I wonder about the travel when she was a lawyer and what that seemed like from your point of view. It comes across in the film as pretty terrifying, actually.
Right. No, that's a good question. She was a very political person at every level, both in terms of interpersonal politics, in her personal life, in her work life, and in the world at large. She was a great student of history, but was riveted by electoral politics all the time. So she had 18 years as a litigator, 2 years in politics, one as a state senator, one as a borough president, and then 30 years on the court after that. So the technical, actual political career was very short. It was just 2 years. And when it was over, when she went to the bench, she was quite relieved, because when she was in politics, she and my father used to go out 2 or 3 nights a week. My father had to have 2 tuxedos. It was just very, very demanding. And I think she was really glad when it was over, although she was always interested in what was going on. Once she got to the federal bench, she was just ferociously scrupulous about never being involved in any kind of partisan, political anything. But she was always aware of what was going on. The travel was a lot. It was usually not more than a week at a time. Sometimes it was 10 days, and I think I can remember the 2 or 3 2-week trips maybe, because when your mother's away for 2 weeks, you really feel it. I mean, when she's away for a week, it's kind of great, but by the second week, it's not so good. And I wasn't aware of it being particularly dangerous, but I think I osmosed a certain amount from my dad, who was good about not saying he was worried, but kids always pick that stuff up. It was a lot. It was a lot.
Let me follow up on the question about politics and ask this. You said that she was very careful not to involve herself in electoral politics once she went on the bench. I wonder, though, if you can comment on the question of whether the skills that she learned in politics she later used in maneuvering as a federal judge, particularly the first black woman federal judge.
Yeah. Let's see, when she first got to the courthouse, there was another film made about her just before I made mine in 2009 at Quinnipiac University, and there's a great quote in there. She's being interviewed at the courthouse when she's just starting, and the interviewer asks her how she feels about being around all these men, because you see in the picture, she's the only woman ever in the Southern District in New York. And she said, well, I'm obviously going to have to work extra hard and really study a lot just to keep up with the men, which was ridiculous. I mean, it was a joke. She said it, I think people believed it when she said it, but she certainly didn't mean it. The politics within the courthouse are really tricky, because everybody's appointed for life. You can't fire anyone. Judges have to go to the judicial conference every year because of an act of Congress. Requires federal judges to go to their circuit conference every year, because if you didn't have that, people appointed for life would be, oh, I was going to be there, my son is graduating, or my mother's ill, I couldn't make it. So that's the level of maneuverability you have. So even if you're a chief judge, as she was, it's very difficult. When Clarence Thomas got to the Supreme Court and replaced Thurgood Marshall, he actually replaced Thurgood as the presiding justice over the Second Circuit. And one of the reasons she took senior status when she did was she could not stand to be around Clarence Thomas for obvious reasons. And around 1995, we were in Nevis, where where her parents were from, and my parents built a house in Nevis on land that my grandparents had. And the New York Federal Bar Council, which is an organization of all the lawyers in New York who come from the big firms and argue in federal courts, they have a warm weather place every winter for a conference. They were in Nevis, and a bunch of the lawyers there were friends of mine by that time, and they were over at our house, and they said to her, you really should try to reach out to Clarence Thomas, because he's so, he's out there, on this weird, faraway planet, but at least if he has some personal connection to people, maybe that will give him a reason years from now to kind of come back. But if he's completely frozen out. So she said, all right. And so she and my father went and met Clarence and his wife at the Four Seasons, took them all around Nevis, had a great time. He's a very affable guy. And then a few months later, he writes this opinion that says Brown was wrongly decided. At which point my mother said, I'll never get that afternoon back. You know, that was a big waste of time. So the politics there are very constrained. They exist because they're people, but it's a tricky business. I think she was one of the few people for whom going to Southern District was not a personal promotion. You know, she was a famous person when she got to the court. Now, when she got to the court, all the guys you see in the photograph, that most of them were Wall Street lawyers, and she was not welcome particularly. And in fact, President Johnson was going to appoint her to the Second Circuit to replace Thurgood. The resistance from the New York bar was heavy. The fury and resistance from the judges on the Second Circuit was overwhelming. They could not, it was enough to have had one black person up there, to have a woman up there who was also black was really just beyond the pale. They couldn't stand it, and Johnson decided to just not fight the fight and put her in the district court. Mm-hmm. So it was very political, but it's curious that when she started, the docket at the Second Circuit was a lot of Wall Street cases. I mean, that was what that court was. But then the Vietnam War came, the women's movement came, the docket changed. So suddenly, you know, her experience as a civil rights lawyer became enormously important, and she had an experience that most of the other guys never had. So times change.
Mm-hmm. Other questions from the audience?
First of all, thank you for being here with us today. This has been great. I think one of the most powerful messages from the film was how mission-driven your mother was. Mm-hmm. And she felt like she had a job to do. So my question is, if you could shed any light on what inspired her. Like, was she inspired by the rule of law, some abstract ideal, maybe seeing people suffering or seeing injustice or something she read? Do you have any sense of that?
Sure. So my mother grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, which is not Jackson, Mississippi, or any other such place. There was a little bit of segregation in New Haven. You know, if you're black, you couldn't go to the Seven Rock Beach on Fridays, you know, but that was about it. Otherwise, blacks and the West Indian community worked sort of like Italians or Irish people. They're just all poor together. And so it wasn't necessarily a huge reaction to that. But when she got to go to college, and I'll tell you a story about how that happened, but when she got to go to college, she went to Fisk in Tennessee because she had never been to the South. She wanted to see what it was like. And in those days, you take a train to Cincinnati, then you had to change trains and take one down to Tennessee, and then you had to sit in segregated cars once you left Cincinnati. And they had signs, you know, that said colored and white, you know, and she took the colored sign when she went home to show her parents, just ripped it off the train. And my grandparents were really a little flipped out because they thought she could have been arrested or shot or something. But that's, I think, where things started to take off. She later transferred to NYU for college because Fisk was kind of wobbling in the Second World War, and then went to Columbia Law School. But you may wonder, how did this relatively poor black woman end up at Columbia Law School in 1943? So when she graduated from Hill House High School in New Haven in 1939, she just got a job as a dental assistant or something and was trying to figure out what to do. And she was involved in a local community center that had been built by Clarence Blakesley, a very famous contractor in New Haven, very wealthy guy. And the community center was not doing well, had a lot of problems. And so they had a public hearing to try to see if they could resolve the problems. And she spoke at this hearing, and he was in the audience. And she was as you can see, she was a very able speaker. And after it was over, he came over to her and said, "That was such a great speech. You should come to my office and we'll talk." So one day she went over to his office. And he said, "So where do you go to college?" And she said, "I don't go to college." He said, "Why not?" She said, "We don't have any money to send me to college." You know, her father was the chef at the Skull and Bones at Yale, and had 9 kids. And Clarence Blakesley said, "Well, I guess I will, I'll pay for you to go to school as long as you want to go." Just like that. and he paid every dime for NYU and Fisk and Columbia Law School. Just, it's amazing. And of course, when she got out of law school, she couldn't get a job anywhere in any law firm. I mean, neither could Sandra Day O'Connor, 15 years later. But she worked for Thurgood as a law student at this little storefront, the Legal Defense Fund, and went there after graduation, and that was the right place to go. And that's what she wanted to do from being a law student. She had known a little bit about lawyers in New Haven. There was a black lawyer there that she heard about, who she had a lot of respect for, and that was, I think, effective. She says in her autobiography she decided at 15 to be a lawyer. I think that's true, but I'm not sure.
Other questions?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of realizing how significant your mother was when you were growing up, and whether that influenced you to go to law school, or whether she encouraged you to go to law school.
So, things like that as a kid you kind of absorb slowly over time. So she was on TV when I was 4 and 5, so I figured something seriously was happening, and I guess, by the time I was 11 was when the March on Washington was happening, so that was another indicator. And she took me to Mississippi when I was 9. She was working on the Meredith case, just to see it and meet people. And while she was working on the case during the day and Medgar was helping her, Medgar's wife, Merle, would take care of me with her kids during the day. And it was very nice, and we got to see Mississippi. It was wild, because as a New York kid, suddenly you saw these segregated water fountains, and Merle took us to the park one day in Mississippi, and it was 120 degrees, and we're sitting in the shade, and this poor old white policeman comes over and says, "I'm so sorry to have to say this, but you can't stay here. You have to go to the black section." It was over there in the blazing sun. And I just said, "I'm going to tell my mother about this." And but I think when Medgar was killed about a year or two later, that's one of the reasons she decided to start thinking about career alternatives, because she figured that could have been me, or could have been her.
And I saw one additional hand. Last question.
I'm curious as to how your mom and thoughts of your mother informed your own career trajectory, and how it continues to do so.
Right, you asked me that. So as you'll see in the bulletin, if you read the little article they did, I remember when I was about 9 or 10 talking to my mother about my desire to be a policeman or fireman. And she said, "Why would you want to do that?" I said, "Because then you could be helpful to people." And she said, "Well, lawyers can help people." And I said, "Really? How would that happen?" And and she said, "Well, if somebody was injured and they couldn't work because of the injury on their job, you could help them get a settlement, then they could pay their rent. They could, And I started to think about it then. By the time I was in college, like most people in my college class, couldn't figure out what to do. So, like you guys, couldn't figure it out. So here you are. But when I was in college, late in college, right after I got out of college, I met a guy who had gone to Harvard Law School who was a movie director. Actually, it was a movie producer. It was a big deal in studios. And I heard, and I said, "What did you do?" He said, "Oh, I went to law school at Harvard." I said, "Wow, how did you So he told me some stuff I couldn't remember. Anyway, the day I graduated, my parents came up here to pick me up. We drove back to Manhattan, and we went to V&T's Pizza right next to Columbia Law School. And I said, I really would like to be a filmmaker. And they just laughed. Nervous laughter, but they laughed, and it was crushing. I was so sure that I would rather do that than this. But I was so devastated by the laughter, it took me 30 years to recover. So, but I went into corporate law practice because it was the seat closest to the door. I knew I wasn't going to be a litigator. I didn't want to like repeat all of that. And it was great. And so 5 years of corporate practice really set me up for business. So I went into investment banking after I was rescued by Senator Moynihan from law practice. And somebody may rescue you too one day.
Well, you did become a filmmaker.
I did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much
you.
for this wonderful film.
Okay.